My name is Robert Callahan, and I am 76 years old. 2 weeks before Christmas last year, my daughter-in-law looked across her own dining room table, in front of her parents, her sister's family, and my son, and told the table, with a light, dismissive little laugh, that I was just some nobody veteran who liked to talk about the Army more than he should, someone who'd probably filed paperwork somewhere for a few years and never actually done anything worth mentioning. What she didn't know, and what my own son had never bothered to fully explain to her in 6 years of marriage, was that 40 minutes later, a car with 2 flags on the hood pulled into that driveway, and a 3-star general walked through her front door, came to attention in her front hallway, and saluted me before he'd even taken off his coat. If you've ever sat quietly through being underestimated by someone who never once thought to ask about your actual history, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about proving my daughter-in-law wrong for a careless comment. It's about the particular ache of 30 years of quiet service colliding, without any warning at all, with a single dismissive sentence at a Christmas table. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly how this evening actually unfolded. I need to tell you who I was before that dinner table, because otherwise a general walking through a front door won't carry the weight it's actually supposed to carry. I was born in 1949 in a small town outside of Macon, Georgia, the only son of a postal worker and a woman who ran the front desk at the county hospital for nearly 30 years. I enlisted in the Army in 1968, 19 years old, and served 2 tours in Vietnam, returning home in 1971 with a Bronze Star I rarely mention and a particular quiet that took Carol, the woman who would become my wife 2 years later, a long time to fully understand. I stayed in the Army after that, and over the following 29 years, I built a career that most people understandably assume ended somewhere fairly ordinary, given how little I've ever volunteered about the specifics. I want to tell you specifically about the shape of that career, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that happened at that Christmas table decades later. After Vietnam, I spent several years in fairly conventional infantry postings, the kind of work that builds a soldier's foundation without generating much in the way of a specific story. Long stretches at Fort Benning and later Fort Bragg, training exercises, garrison duty, the unglamorous rhythm of peacetime service that most people outside the military never think much about. It was during those years, in the late 1970s, that a battalion commander I served under noticed something in the way I approached small unit leadership, a particular attentiveness to the individual soldiers under me rather than simply the tasks in front of us. And he began quietly steering my career in a direction I hadn't fully anticipated for myself. By the early 1980s, I had been selected for increasingly specialized training, and I spent the middle third of my service, roughly 14 years altogether, in roles within Army Special Operations that I still can't discuss in full detail even now, decades later, given the specific nature of what those units do, and the standards of discretion that remain expected of those of us who served in them, regardless of how much time has passed. I can tell you, in the broadest possible terms, that this work involved extended deployments to environments most Americans have never heard of and never will. Work that demanded a particular kind of quiet competence under genuine pressure, and work that, by its very nature, could never be discussed at a dinner table, not then and not now. I want to describe, as best I can within the bounds of what I'm still able to share, the specific texture of those years. There were stretches of 8, 9, sometimes 10 months where Carol received only sporadic, carefully worded letters, where she raised David largely on her own, managing a household and a young son's questions about where his father actually was, with a patience and steadiness I've never fully been able to properly thank her for, not while she was alive, and not now, 6 years after her passing. I remember specific moments from those deployments that I still carry. Memories that surface at unexpected times, the particular quality of exhaustion that settles into your body after weeks in the field, the specific bond that forms between soldiers who have depended on each other in circumstances where the margin for error simply doesn't exist. I lost friends during those years, good men whose names are etched into memorials I visit privately, on my own, without telling anyone in my family exactly where I've gone or why. In 1991, at the recommendation of a colonel I'd served under for nearly 6 years, I was selected for a 9-year posting, spread across several rotations, training and advising foreign military units in partner nations, work that required not just tactical competence, but a genuine gift for teaching, for breaking down complex skills into something a young officer from an entirely different military culture could absorb and eventually master himself. I trained hundreds of officers during those years, some of them barely out of their own country's equivalent of officer candidate school. Nervous, eager, uncertain young men who I watched grow, over months and sometimes years, into confident, capable leaders. I want to be honest that this particular chapter of my career became, in many ways, the one I'm proudest of, not because of any specific dramatic incident, but because of the sheer cumulative weight of it, the specific knowledge that dozens of officers across multiple countries carried forward lessons I had personally, patiently taught them, lessons that shaped decisions they would go on to make for the rest of their own careers. I finished my career from 1994 until my retirement in 1997, serving on the personal staff of a 2-star general, work that put me in rooms with decision-makers most soldiers never encountered directly, briefing senior officers, coordinating between multiple commands, handling the specific, high-stakes logistics that most people never think about when they imagine what a general's daily work actually looks like. I retired in 1997 as a command sergeant major, the senior enlisted rank in the entire Army, a rank that exactly 6 soldiers out of every 100 who enlist will ever reach. A rank that represented, for me, not just personal achievement but the specific, cumulative weight of 29 years spent trying to be worthy of the soldiers who had trusted my leadership. I want to be honest about the actual weight of that career, because I think it's easy for people to assume a retired soldier's importance ended the day he took off the uniform. In some ways that's true. There were no more headlines, no more urgent deployments, no more young officers looking to me for guidance in the field. But the relationships built across 29 years of service, the specific bonds formed with soldiers I trained, soldiers who went on to build their own careers, some of whom eventually became general officers themselves, don't simply end when you retire. They become something quieter, something that mostly stays invisible, folded into holiday cards and the occasional phone call, until, every so often, without warning, it doesn't stay invisible at all. I want to tell you about one soldier in particular, because his name matters to the rest of this story. In 2000, 3 years into my retirement, a young captain named Marcus Webb was assigned to a unit where I'd been asked to consult briefly during a transition period, one of the last pieces of occasional work I did for the Army after formally retiring. Webb was talented but, at the time, still finding his footing as a leader, carrying a certain uncertainty about his own decision-making that I recognized from my own younger years. I spent roughly 4 months mentoring him during that assignment, not through any formal program, simply through the ordinary daily conversations that happened between an experienced retired soldier and a young officer hungry to learn. Conversations about leadership under pressure, about the specific weight of decisions that affect other people's lives, about the particular discipline required to lead soldiers you genuinely care about into circumstances where you can't guarantee everyone comes home unchanged. I didn't think much, at the time, about the specific long-term impact of those 4 months. It was simply the kind of work I'd done for decades, the kind of quiet, unglamorous mentorship that rarely gets remembered by the person giving it, precisely because it doesn't feel remarkable while it's happening. I lost touch with Webb for long stretches over the following 2 decades, the way you do with dozens of soldiers you've crossed paths with over a career, receiving the occasional holiday card, an email every year or two, brief updates as his own career progressed, a promotion here, a new posting there, updates I read with a quiet, private pride but never discussed in any detail with my own family, because David had never particularly asked, and I'd never particularly volunteered. I met Carol in 1973 at a hospital dance organized for returning servicemen, and we married the following year. Carol was a nurse, patient and perceptive in ways that complemented my own more reserved temperament, and she carried, throughout our 41 years of marriage until her passing 6 years ago, a genuine understanding that most of what I'd actually done during those 29 years simply wasn't meant to be discussed openly, an understanding she never pushed against, trusting instead that whatever weight I carried from those deployments and those years of training young officers was mine to manage in my own time and my own way. I want to be honest that Carol's steadiness during those years, the specific way she held our household together through months and sometimes the better part of a year without me present, without ever once complaining to David about my absence in a way that might have burdened him, was its own form of quiet service, one I don't think I fully appreciated until much later in our marriage, when I finally had the time and the distance to look back clearly at everything she'd carried. We had one son, David, born in 1976, and I want to be honest that raising him, particularly during the years I spent on deployments and postings I could never fully explain, created its own particular distance between us, one that carried, largely unaddressed, into his adult life. I remember specific stretches of David's childhood, missing entire school years' worth of events, birthdays celebrated over crackling long-distance phone calls when the connection allowed for it at all, coming home some years to a son who had visibly grown, who had developed habits and interests and small changes in the way he spoke that I hadn't been present for, gaps that Carol would gently manage on my behalf, offering David some general, age-appropriate reassurance about where his father actually was, without ever revealing details she herself, in many cases, didn't fully have access to either. David grew up, as a result, with a fairly thin understanding of what I'd actually done across 29 years of service, knowing only the vaguest outline, that I'd served for a long time, that I'd reached a senior enlisted rank, that I'd been overseas more than most fathers, but never developing much specific curiosity about what any of it actually meant in practice. An understandable gap given how little I'd ever volunteered to fill it with real detail, and given how much of what I actually did remained, by necessity, simply not something I was in a position to discuss even if he'd asked directly. David built his own career in software sales, a field with its own visible, measurable markers of success, and he married his wife Melissa 6 years ago, a warm, capable woman I'd genuinely come to like over the years, even if our relationship, by the nature of how recently they'd married, remained still relatively new and developing at the time of this story. I want to be fair to both of them here, because it would be easy to paint this story as simple cruelty, and that isn't accurate. David has always been a devoted son who calls regularly, who has always expressed general respect for my service, even if that respect was built on a considerably thinner understanding of the specifics than either of us, I think, fully realized until this particular evening. Melissa, for her part, grew up in a family with no military connection whatsoever, her father having spent his career in insurance underwriting, her mother in elementary education, a background that gave her genuinely little frame of reference for understanding what a career like mine might actually have involved. I don't believe she ever intended real malice with what she eventually said at that dinner table. What I'd noticed, though, over 6 years of family gatherings, Thanksgivings and birthdays, and the occasional Sunday dinner, was a certain pattern in how she discussed my service, treating it as a kind of background biographical detail, something old men mention fondly the way they might mention an old job or an old hobby, rather than anything with real specific weight or consequence, an assumption built entirely on the fact that David himself had never given her the full picture, largely because he'd never fully had it himself. A gap in understanding that had simply been allowed to persist, unquestioned and uncorrected, across the entire span of their relationship. 2 weeks before Christmas, we gathered at David and Melissa's house for a dinner combining both sides of the extended family, her parents visiting from Ohio, her sister's family driving in from 2 hours away, a warm, genuinely full house on an ordinary Saturday evening, the dining room table extended with an extra leaf to fit all 9 of us, Melissa's mother having brought a pecan pie she was clearly proud of, the general atmosphere warm and unremarkable in the way most ordinary family dinners are. Conversation drifted, as these things do, toward everyone's various careers and backgrounds around the table, Melissa's father discussing his own 31 years in insurance underwriting with the specific pride of a man nearing his own retirement, her sister's husband describing a recent promotion to regional manager at a logistics company, the conversation moving pleasantly, unremarkably, from person to person, until it eventually turned toward me. "Dad served in the Army for like 30 years, David said, gesturing toward me with obvious, if somewhat vague, pride, the way a person might mention a relative's long tenure at any unremarkable job. "Command Sergeant Major, right, Dad? That's like a pretty senior rank, isn't it?" "It's the most senior enlisted rank there is," I said, mildly, not particularly eager to expand further, the way I'd learned, over decades, to answer this exact kind of question, briefly, factually, without inviting further discussion. Melissa, perhaps not fully thinking through how the comment would land, and perhaps emboldened by 2 glasses of wine and the general light-hearted mood of the table, laughed lightly and said, "Honestly, Robert loves bringing up the Army stuff more than he probably should. I think it's sweet, I really do, but I always figure it's like, he filed paperwork somewhere for a few decades and got a nice title out of it. No offense, Robert. I just mean, I don't think anybody at this table actually knows what a command sergeant whatever it is even really did all day, and I kind of doubt it was anything too dramatic. It's not like you were some secret agent or something." She laughed again at her own comment, and her sister laughed along with her, the two of them clearly enjoying what they understood to be gentle, affectionate teasing rather than anything genuinely dismissive. I sat there, 76 years old, holding my coffee cup, absorbing the particular sting of having nearly 3 decades of genuinely difficult, often dangerous, often deeply consequential service, casually reduced to paperwork and exaggeration, spoken plainly, and with real confidence in front of her entire extended family, a room full of people whose entire understanding of who I actually was had just been shaped, in that exact moment, by a joke built on almost nothing at all. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger. Men of my generation, particularly those who spent careers in the kind of quiet, classified work that by its very nature can never be fully explained, develop a certain capacity to absorb this kind of casual dismissal without much visible reaction. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a tired, familiar recognition of exactly how completely my own decades of necessary silence had shaped the picture everyone at that table now carried of who I actually was. I didn't correct her. I made a mild comment about different chapters of service looking different from the outside, and let the conversation move on to other topics, the way these moments often do, absorbed back into the general flow of a pleasant family dinner, rather than confronted directly. David, to his credit, glanced at me with a brief flicker of something like uncertainty, as though some small part of him recognized the comment had perhaps landed with more weight than his wife intended, but he said nothing further, and the conversation moved on to Melissa's sister's upcoming kitchen renovation. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advanced knowledge whatsoever that it was coming, and the specific mechanics of how it unfolded matter considerably to understanding why it carried the weight it eventually did. About 30 minutes later, while Melissa's mother was serving that pecan pie, and the conversation had moved on entirely to unrelated topics, my phone buzzed quietly in my pocket with a text from a number I recognized instantly, a soldier I had personally trained and mentored more than 2 decades earlier, a young captain back then, who had gone on to build a career I'd followed with real quiet pride from a distance, now serving as a lieutenant general at a nearby installation. He'd texted simply asking if I was still at the address David had mentioned to him weeks earlier during an unrelated logistics conversation about visiting the area for a regional conference, explaining he was in town through the weekend and wanted to stop by briefly to say hello, something he'd apparently been planning for weeks without my knowledge, intending it as a genuine, warm surprise rather than anything with the specific timing or drama it eventually carried. I texted back the address without much thought, genuinely not anticipating what his specific arrival would look like, or what kind of impression it might make on a room full of people who, 30 minutes earlier, had just finished laughing about paperwork and continued the evening's conversation, helping myself to a slice of that pecan pie, until, about 40 minutes later, headlights swept slowly across the front windows, followed by the specific, distinctive sound of a car door closing with the kind of precision that suggested someone stepping out in full uniform rather than casual weekend clothes, and David, glancing out through the front curtains with visible confusion, said, "Dad, there's a car outside with actual flags on it. 2 of them on the hood." I want to describe what happened next as it actually happened, without exaggeration, because I've told this part of the story to enough people since that evening to know it sounds, on its surface, almost too dramatic to be true, and yet it happened exactly this way. Lieutenant General Marcus Webb walked up that driveway in his full-service uniform, having come directly from an evening event at the nearby installation rather than changing first, and when David opened the front door, uncertain and visibly nervous, General Webb stepped past him into that front hallway, saw me sitting at the dining table roughly 15 feet away, and came immediately to attention, snapping into a full, formal salute before he'd said a single word of greeting to anyone else in the room, before he'd even fully removed his coat. "Sergeant Major Callahan," he said, his voice carrying the specific formal clarity of a parade ground address rather than a casual greeting. "It's an honor, sir. I wouldn't be standing in this uniform today, in this rank, without what you taught me 23 years ago." He held that salute a full 3 seconds, an eternity in the specific silence that had fallen over that dining room, before crossing the room and shaking my hand warmly. Both hands, actually. The way you greet someone whose importance to your life genuinely can't be adequately expressed through a single handshake. The entire dining room behind him had gone completely, utterly silent. 9 people frozen mid-motion. Melissa's mother still holding the pie server, her father's fork halfway to his mouth, the specific silence that happens when a room full of people simultaneously realizes they've badly misjudged the shape of something. Melissa's father was the first to speak, setting down his fork slowly, asking, with visible shock, "Is that a general? An actual general? In our dining room?" "Lieutenant General," David said quietly, staring at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him in years, something between disbelief and a kind of dawning, uncomfortable recognition. "Dad, is this the person you're always so cagey about mentioning?" General Webb, apparently sensing immediately the specific texture of confusion in the room, and perhaps catching some fragment of the earlier conversation from David's expression, pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down, still in uniform, and spent the next 20 minutes explaining, unprompted and with obvious genuine warmth, exactly what I had actually done across those years. The specific training program I'd personally built for junior officers, heading into some of the most demanding environments in the Army. The way I'd personally mentored him through his most difficult early command decisions during a rotation that, he mentioned, had nearly ended in a catastrophic mistake if I hadn't intervened at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right piece of guidance. The reputation I still carried, entirely unknown to my own family, among an entire generation of officers who considered me one of the most significant influences on their careers. "There's a whole group of us," General Webb said, looking around the table at faces still processing what they were hearing. "Officers Sergeant Major Callahan trained back in the 90s, who still talk to each other, still compare notes on what he taught us. I'd guess there are at least a dozen of us now serving at the general officer level who'd tell you the exact same thing I'm telling you tonight. He doesn't talk about it. He's never talked about it, as far as I know. But we talk about him." Melissa sat through this entire explanation with a steadily reddening face, her wine glass forgotten in front of her, and once General Webb finally departed after a warm, brief visit, apologizing genuinely for the disruption to their evening, and insisting, with real sincerity, that he simply hadn't wanted to pass through the area without stopping to see me, Melissa turned to me, visibly shaken, her earlier lightness entirely gone. "Robert," she said, "I am so sorry. I had absolutely no idea. David, why didn't I know any of this? Why have you never told me any of this? Because I didn't fully know it myself, David admitted quietly, still staring at the now empty chair General Webb had briefly occupied. Not like that. Not in real detail. I knew Dad served a long time. I knew the rank sounded important, but I'm realizing right now, sitting here, how little I ever actually asked him directly about any of it. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily vindication. It was something closer to a tired, familiar recognition of exactly how completely my own chosen discretion had shaped my own family's understanding of who I actually was. I'm not upset about the comment, Melissa, I said. You said what you understood to be true, based on what you'd actually been told, which wasn't much. That's not really your fault. We talked for nearly 2 hours after everyone else had gone quiet with their own thoughts. Melissa's parents eventually saying their goodbyes with a warmth and respect that felt entirely different from the earlier part of the evening. Her sister's family lingering a while longer, genuinely curious now in a way that felt different from polite family interest. David asked real questions for the first time in years that evening, questions about specific postings, about what it had actually felt like to train soldiers who went on to lead their own units into difficult circumstances, about the specific weight of watching young officers like Marcus Webb grow into leaders I could be genuinely proud of from a distance. Melissa listened throughout with a kind of genuine humbled attention I hadn't seen from her before, occasionally asking her own questions, careful and specific, clearly working to actually understand, rather than simply fill an awkward silence with polite interest. I feel terrible, Robert, she said again, toward the end of that long evening, once most of the extended family had gone home. I've spent 6 years thinking of you as just, I don't know, a nice older man who used to be in the army a long time ago. I never once asked you a real question about any of it. I never gave you much reason to, I said. That's not an excuse for what I did or didn't share, Melissa. It's simply the truth. I've spent most of my adult life not talking about this, and I think somewhere along the way, that habit became less about genuine necessity and more about simple comfort with staying quiet. You responded to the version of me you were actually given access to. In the weeks since that dinner, something has genuinely shifted in how David relates to me. He calls considerably more often, not just for logistics or holiday coordination, but to actually talk, asking specific questions about my career, about individual soldiers I trained, about what those extended deployments had actually felt like for both Carol and me during the years he was growing up. He mentioned, during one recent call, that he'd started researching some of what he could find publicly about the specific units and postings I'd been part of, wanting, in his own words, to understand his father as an actual person rather than a vague biographical outline. Melissa has become, in her own way, considerably more curious about my history than I ever anticipated. She's asked, more than once, whether I'd be willing to sit down properly and tell her more about specific years, about Carol's experience raising David largely alone during my longest deployments, about what it actually meant to reach the rank I eventually reached. She mentioned, during a recent visit, that she'd started paying closer attention at social gatherings whenever another veteran was present, no longer assuming, the way she once might have, that a modest, quiet demeanor meant a modest, unremarkable history behind it. General Webb, for his part, has stayed in closer touch since that evening than he had in the several years prior, calling every few months now rather than simply exchanging holiday cards, and he's mentioned, more than once, that he'd like to arrange for me to speak with a group of younger officers he currently mentors, an invitation I've been seriously considering, given how much satisfaction I still find, even decades after retirement, in passing along whatever I learned across those 29 years, to soldiers still building their own careers. I've also noticed, in the months since, that David has started speaking differently about my service to his own friends and colleagues, describing me now with a considerably more accurate and detailed understanding, someone whose quiet decades of training and mentorship had genuinely shaped an entire generation of officers, even if the specifics remained, by necessity, somewhat general given the nature of much of what I'd actually done. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old veteran dismissed at a Christmas gathering, or because I need a general salute to validate 3 decades of service I already knew the value of, long before anyone else in that room understood it. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The quiet, largely invisible service many of us gave across our careers often carries weight considerably more significant than the people closest to us have any way of knowing, simply because we ourselves, for whatever reason, professional discretion, simple habit, the particular quiet that settles into a person after decades of not being able to discuss the specifics of their own life, never gave them the material to understand differently. That doesn't mean our worth depends on some dramatic, unplanned moment eventually revealing the truth. It means dignity was already there, quietly, waiting patiently for someone curious enough to finally ask the right question. Or in my case, for a car with 2 flags on the hood to pull, unannounced, into an ordinary driveway on an otherwise ordinary December evening. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose actual service or actual worth you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.